April 1949, and the RMS Magdalena, brand new, fresh paint sparkling in the sun, is a lame duck. She's under tow after a terrible collision, and she's just hours from safety when suddenly the ship starts breaking in half, absolutely without warning. Tugboat captains and their crew watch on helplessly as the ship parts. In a desperate attempt to keep the ship together and in place, the captain drops his anchors, but it's no use. With the rending of steel, the ship breaks completely apart, and the back half begins to drift pathetically away. Inside it are thousands of tons of valuable cargo and passenger baggage. The forward half begins to sink right away. The epic saga of the Magdalena has all the hallmarks of a tale stranger than fiction. A luxurious ship on its first voyage, the captain set for retirement after this trip, a slight blow that results in total disaster, and that fine new ship broken in half. If this sounds familiar, you might be forgiven for thinking we're talking about the Titanic again. But this happened in 1949 to one of Britain's newest and finest passenger ships. Magdalena was doomed. But what exactly had gone wrong? Why had this ship, bristling with the latest technology and navigational aids, ended up in disaster? And why did she break apart? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and today we'll be embarking on the first and the last voyage of the RMS Magdalena. In the wake of the Second World War, Britain faced the mammoth task of rebuilding their economy on top of repaying wartime debts to other countries. This dilemma was further compounded by the unexpected ending of the American Lend-Lease assistance in 1945, the pact that had supplied Britain with wartime relief supplies valued at $31.4 billion. Once President Truman officially announced the end of the lease, Britain was forced to rely on loans and austerity measures to try and keep the economy afloat. It had been one of the victorious Allied powers, but now this war winner was forced into food and fuel rationing. This, of course, was not ideal. Britain couldn't supply its country with their own domestic materials. To secure their essential resources, they had to look beyond their borders, which meant resurrecting their international shipping routes and the fleet of merchant vessels which had been devastated by German U-boats back in the war. The Royal Mail Line, one of Britain's principal passenger and cargo operators out to South America, had lost 20 of their 32 seagoing ships during the war, including one of their best, the modern motor ship Highland Patriot, which was caught and torpedoed by the U-38 off Bishop Rock. In the immediate post-war world, the Royal Mail Line's fleet was stretched very thin. They still had Highland Patriot's 4 sister ships, but before the war, their service out to South America was an efficient affair, with a ship leaving London every 2 weeks on the dot. And all they had was a fleet of 10 tired, worn-out pre-war ships that desperately needed overhaul. If they were to restore their former glory, they would need a new ship to do the job. In 1946, they engaged their old friends at Harland & Wolff in Belfast, the master shipbuilders who had constructed some of the line's finest vessels, including Highland Patriot, and they commissioned a brand new refrigerated cargo passenger liner. With a budget of $25 million, the shipping yard got to work. Magdalena's keel was first laid in August 1946, with a completion expected within the same year, but things didn't go according to plan. Good steel and building materials were scarce at the shipyard, as was their workforce. With only a relative few hands on deck, Magdalena's construction was delayed by nearly 2 years, until finally, on May 11th, 1948, she made her long-awaited public debut. At her launch at Harland & Wolff, the public oohed and ahed at the magnificent new 17,500-ton vessel in all her glory. Bob Bankhead, a former Harland & Wolff welder who had worked on Magdalena, recalled the day with pride. It was a big deal for Harland & Wolff because, he said, it was the first passenger ship built in Harland & Wolff after the war. In fact, it was the third biggest ship built in a British yard at the time. This was especially important for the yard, which had suffered badly itself under sustained German air raids and the Belfast Blitz. The yard had done their work well. Magdalena had been fitted out in just 9 months after launch, a minor miracle in and of itself. Magdalena measured roughly 550 feet or 167 metres in length, with a 73-foot 22-metre beam. She bore an unmistakable resemblance to the other Royal Mail A-class liners that had come before her, but Harland & Wolff had given her a sleek, modern silhouette to make it clear that this was a liner for a new era. The officers' accommodation and bridge were kept well forward of the main superstructure in a freestanding island that overlooked the forecastle deck, giving the bridge crew excellent visibility. Facing the tower were the passenger deck houses, glassed off at the forward end with 3 decks of floor-to-ceiling windows for the first-class lounges and smoking room. Beneath her single, streamlined funnel were her 133 comfortable first-class cabins that came in either single or double passenger rooms. The rooms were spread across the promenade and bridge decks, each fitted throughout with air conditioning for the humid South American climate. Those travelling on a budget were met with comfortable, yet austere, third-class cabins, 347 of them, with 2, 4, 8 or 10 beds to a room, all of which were fitted with a wash basin. Each room featured simple but functional furniture with mirrors that spanned from the carpeted decks to the ceilings. The dining spaces were divided between first and third class too. First class could sup within the salmon cream coloured hardwood side-panelled room, enjoying Spanish fine wine surrounded by huge mirrors. The third class dining space wasn't as impressive, but it was quaint and welcoming, with parties of 6 to a table. On the hotter days at sea, as Magdalena reached the equator, passengers could go for a plunge in the open-air pool on the promenade deck or refresh themselves with a beverage at the Lido-style bar cafe. If cooling down outside didn't appeal to some of the more senior passengers, they instead could fall asleep beneath the grey oak beams of the smoking lounge decorated with Tyrolean motifs and tapestries. Among Magdalena's other leisurely interiors were libraries, a reading room, a gymnasium, as well as a children's play area. But, in truth, the ship's true appeal and purpose was not the comfortable accommodations on offer. In fact, for a ship her size, her passenger capacity was very small. Instead, it was her cargo that set her apart. Space enough for 460,000 cubic feet of refrigerated meat and fruit, all crucial for British markets back home. She would help operate the meat special route between Britain and Argentina, and her lovely silhouette was interrupted by towering cargo handling booms and electric derricks. Magdalena was an impressive ship, and her machinery was top-notch to match. 2 double reduction-geared Parsons turbines powered her twin propellers, which generated top speeds of 18 knots. This wasn't exceptionally fast by passenger liner standards, but it was still a decent turn of speed for the run out to South America, which wasn't nearly as breakneck competitive as the transatlantic routes to the United States were. Magdalena was also kitted out with the latest navigational equipment: gyro compasses, magnetic compasses, autopilot features, echo sounders, and a Metropolitan Vickers C-scan radar, which could detect coastlines, vessels, and navigational hazards in poor visibility. With all her fancy equipment, the odds of her meeting with nautical disaster should have been next to none. On the 9th of March 1949, some 347 passengers and 237 crew boarded the decks of Magdalena at London, excited to escape the grey fog for the warmer climates of Spain and South America. It was a moment of excitement and huge pride for her builders, operators, crew, and those first passengers lucky enough to enjoy the ship for the first time. And who among them couldn't feel proud looking at the gleaming pine decking and the fresh white paint, the brand new crockery, and the pristine white bedding that had never been used. Ticket clerks punched holes in the passengers' boarding passes, children squirmed excitedly in their mothers' arms, teary families waved goodbye for now, while on high, Captain Douglas Lee stood at the railing and watched it all. After a 4-decade-long career at sea, this was to be his final voyage, and it was an honour. Royal Mail Lines had granted him command of their newest and finest ship as a kind of parting gift. As he stared wistfully at the ship's proud funnel, taking in her sweeping decks, He must have reflected on the austere packet steamers he had started out on, and now here he was, standing a few stories tall on Britain's newest and loveliest passenger liner. At last, with every passenger aboard, the gangways were hauled in, the mooring lines were cast off, and with a low tremor, Magdalena eased her way from the wharf. Passengers waved goodbye to their families from the ship's decks until there were nothing but smudges in the distance. Once Magdalena had slipped free of London's smoky docks, she threaded her way down the Thames, past the gathering crowds pointing at the magnificent new liner, and then finally she glided towards the open sea, officially on her maiden voyage. Her first stop from Tilbury was Cherbourg, France, before she steamed south, making her way to Vigo and Lisbon, where she took on more passengers. Her long voyage would see her make for Las Palmas before swinging out west across the Atlantic for Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. After a stop at Las Palmas, as the new travellers settled in, Magdalena entered the open Atlantic, beginning the long ocean crossing that would occupy the next few days. This was a time for passengers to explore the polished new dwellings of their ship. They wandered the promenade deck, lounged beside the pool, and they became acquainted with the vessel that would become their home for the next week. At lunches and dinners, passengers chatted excitedly about their travel plans and their thoughts on the ship so far. Between meals, they passed the time reading on the sunlit decks or simply watching the endless expanse of the ocean as it rolled by. After a few non-eventful days at sea, the coast of Brazil loomed on the horizon, and when the steep granite coastline materialised through the morning haze, passengers were undoubtedly excited to stream ashore at Rio. As Magdalena passed through Guanabara Bay, her complement gazed in wonder at the towering silhouette of Sugarloaf Mountain at the harbour's entrance, the white buildings lining the waterfront, the green hills and the distant beaches stretching away beneath aquamarine skies. For many passengers, the sight was a culture shock. Many were only familiar with the grey ports of Europe that were nothing like the one Magdalena was now pulling into. As passengers disembarked, the feeling of the humid Brazilian heat felt like walking straight into a wall. While they made their way up the winding hills of the city, though, Magdalena's crew were back hard at work bunkering their ship and loading supplies for the short leg down to Santos, where she'd be loaded with 20,000 crates of oranges from the groves of Sao Paulo. A few days later, with enough oranges to feed a city, she continued on to her final destination at Buenos Aires for her most impressive bounty yet. A 3,000-ton haul of frozen Argentine meat destined for London's markets. As the crew worked to load her cargo snugly into the refrigerated holds, a complement of 350 passengers boarded the ship to head back to England. So far, the voyage had gone swimmingly, and the weeks spent in South America had gone by in a blur of cargo handling, inspections, and port formalities, leaving little time for leisure for the crew. But Captain Lee was well accustomed to the hustle. Once Magdalena left from Buenos Aires, he must have only had one thing on his mind. There was no place like home, especially with his wife waiting for him there and a happy retirement. To get back to London, Magdalena needed to complete the trip she'd already made in reverse. On April 24th, she left Santos once again bound for Rio, and by mid-evening she passed Buoy Point on the Isle of San Sebastian. But something wasn't quite right with the new ship. At 6 p.m, and then 7, Captain Lee had to make course corrections because it seemed to him that the liner was heading further north than intended, and it risked, unchecked, eventually running into the coast. No matter, he turned her slightly to starboard to run more parallel with the coastline. As her engines purred in the calm waters, lulling weary passengers to sleep, Captain Lee finished up his supper and turned in for the night, handing over the watch to Junior Second Officer Ferguson. The approach to Rio Harbour would present Magdalena's crew with a few obstacles. Just off from the shoreline are the Tijucas Islands, but then, directly ahead, are another series of rocky islands that guard the port. Ilha Redonda to the south, big, imposing, a barren wall of stone, 750 feet, 228 metres tall. 3 miles, or 5 kilometres east, Ilha Rasa, with a lighthouse on top. Just to the north is a group of islands and rocky shoals 2 miles long, including Ilha das Palmas that sits square in the middle of the approach to Rio Harbour. To arrive safely, Magdalena's officers would need to thread the needle between the islands and the mainland. To do it, they needed to keep an eye out for the Palmas and the Rasa lighthouses. But there's a third light too, the lighthouse on an island just off Guarachiba on the mainland. By tracking these lights and keeping all 3 of them within sight of Magdalena's crew, they would know they were on the right approach. With the ship's course set by gyro compass to pass a 1.5 miles north of Palmas Island off the entrance to Rio Harbour, Lee instructed Ferguson to wake him when Guarachiba Point Lighthouse was off the ship's port bow at a relative bearing of 315 degrees. Magdalena was making good time. In fact, she was ahead of schedule. Her engine revolutions would drop from 105 to 70 and the big liner limped along at 13.5 knots. About 10:45 p.m, Captain Lee finally hit the hay for the usual restless night's sleep that captains of big passenger ships were so accustomed to. Magdalena trundled on ahead, straight into disaster. The hours pass as RMS Magdalena slowly threads through the inky waters off the coast of Rio de Janeiro. A light breeze whistles through her ventilators while the sea lays calm and listless, the silence broken only by the gentle hum of the big ship's engines. On the bridge, Senior Second Officer Ferguson is officer of the watch. He checks the ship's bearings, glancing from his compass to the looming black outline of the coastal mountains on the horizon. It's around 2:30 a.m. when he realises that the bridge's compass is behaving oddly. When he compares Magdalena's observed position against her charted course, he realises that she's drifted about 2.5 miles further north than what had been planned. That's odd, he thinks. Ferguson takes action immediately and informs the skipper, who orders him to change course. He uses the gyro compass to veer the ship again to starboard to gradually ease her back onto the proper route. As his heart rate evens out, he thinks of what could have happened had he not caught the mistake, and where Magdalena could have ended up, most likely somewhere on the rocky coast. The time slips by and Ferguson, worried about the compass discrepancies, starts to second-guess his bearings. At 3 a.m, he takes another cross-bearing from the top of the bridge. Again, Magdalena seems to be nudging further north. Surely not. Well, a half hour ticks by and he takes another bearing, but now she seems to be back on track. 20 minutes later, the light from Guarachiba Point appears dim off the port bow and Ferguson takes another reading. Still, Magdalena looks to be on track. Now, with the lighthouse off on a 315-degree bearing, he goes to wake up the captain on the voice pipe. He asks to be woken up again in 40 minutes. 10 minutes later, at 4 a.m, First Officer Senior and Third Officer Rutter arrive on the bridge to relieve Ferguson of his watch. The second officer briefs the men on the ship's progress. Magdalena is making good time on her northeasterly course of 66 degrees, and if all goes well, they should arrive off Ilha Palmas sometime around 10 past 5 a.m. But Ferguson does have one concern. Soon, they will be passing close to the Tijucas Islands and the rocks that guard the entrance to the harbour. Under ordinary circumstances, this would be no cause for concern. But tonight, Ferguson says, the compasses have been playing up. He explains how he had checked the ship's position by stellar observation a few hours ago and discovered she'd wandered further north. Although he'd corrected the error, Ferguson is unconvinced that the compasses are entirely trustworthy. Senior's mouth draws into a hard line, while Rutter's brow furrows. Both are well aware of the danger this poses. Before he turns away, Ferguson passes on one final instruction. Captain Lee wishes to be awakened at 4:30 a.m. sharp for an update. With that, the second officer retires, exhaustion weighing on his bones like chainmail. As the murky dawn light begins to turn the sky a deep purple, First Officer Senior keeps a keen eye out. This is his first time bringing a ship into Rio from the west for a decade. The route chosen for the approach is a tricky one, even during daylight. Somewhere out ahead of them, and off to the left, are the Tijucas Islands and the rocks, with no lights to mark them out. He will need to rely heavily on the lighthouses ahead to guide his path. But the Rasa light is still obscured by Redonda's towering hulk, and the Guarachiba light is falling further and further behind. Around 25 minutes past 4, he finally sees the light from the Ilha Rasa burst from behind Redonda, bright as a moonbeam. Senior climbs to the top of the wheelhouse to obtain a fresh position, but when he searches the blackened path ahead for the lighthouse on the Ilha das Palmas, his second visual aid, he sees only darkness. According to his charts, the light from Palmas should have been visible by now that they were well west of Redonda. Well, needing a second reference point for his cross bearing, Senior uses the next best thing in sight, the illuminated figure of Christ the Redeemer atop the Corcovado mountain overlooking the city far off ahead of Magdalena's port bow. Senior notes down his observations and returns to the chart room to compare his readings to the maps laid flat across the table. As his gaze flicks between his compass and his charts, he realizes that Magdalena is bearing some half a mile northward of her course line, despite that reduction in speed and the course changes earlier. Then, an even more harrowing realization clangs through him. Magdalena is edging dangerously close to the very rocks that Ferguson had warned him about. Senior immediately reports his findings to Captain Lee through the voice pipe in the bridge, and says they'll pass Palmas shortly after 5 a.m. Captain Lee starts to dress in his cabin while Senior heads back up to take another second reading. Maybe he'd got it wrong, he thinks. But as Senior studies his readings once more, his worst fears are confirmed. Magdalena is edging closer and closer to the dark Tijucas rocks. He storms back into the bridge to order the helmsman to haul the ship out to starboard, but before he can get the words out, Third Officer Rutter has his gaze transfixed on something beyond the starboard bow. Still watching the darkness beyond, Rutter claims he's seen an oil slick, but then he suggests it could be the outline of a ship with its lights off. Senior barks an order to the helmsman to port the ship over 3 degrees around the obstacle ahead, and he begins to swing the wooden wheel over. Then, from far below, there's a shudder and a grinding as Magdalena's steel plates rattle and roar. Passengers are shaken awake from their bunks. One of the ship's refrigerating engineers, Bill Harkness, was dressing in his cabin, one leg still in his pajama pants, when the ship careened like she'd been struck by a meteor. Then, immediately following the first blow, she jolted again, more violently than the last. Harkness recalled how he'd heard the big crunch of the ship settling down before being thrown against his bunk. Captain Lee, meanwhile, is in the middle of getting dressed himself when his ship begins to shake. He rushes topside to see what's going on. Ominously, Magdalena has stopped dead in the water. Lee is met by a bridge crew aghast at what's just happened. With sinking dread, they all realise that it's not another ship that Magdalena has struck, but a giant rock from the Tijucas Islands. In a smooth sea, with a very light wind, Britain's finest, newest liner has been driven straight onto the rocks. Soon enough, the whistle to abandon ship shrills out and stewards knock on cabin doors. Women, clad in their nightgowns, hastily help their children with their life jackets before clambering up the stairs to the outer decks, joining the throng of others waiting for instruction. Crew members station themselves across the decks, loudspeakers poised like trumpets, directing distressed passengers to muster for the lifeboats. Neville Strangwood, one of the crewmen, summed up the mood when he remembered that none of us wanted to get the Victoria Cross, all we wanted to do was get off. Luckily for Strangwood and the rest of the passengers, though, help is soon on its way. As soon as the ship struck the rocks, Captain Lee had ordered a distress call. The SOS signal was picked up on shore by the Arpoador radio station at Rio, and the Minister for the Navy was hastily woken up. The urgency of the message prompted an immediate response, and a small flotilla of vessels from the Brazilian Navy were quickly dispatched to the scene. The first was a pair of big ocean-going tugs, the Tritão and the Tenente Claudio. A ship on the rocks might be stuck fast, for now, but history had shown that grounded vessels had a bad habit of refloating without warning and then sinking suddenly. It had resulted in some horrendous incidents. The passenger steamer Princess Sophia had done just that in a storm after she hit rocks, and there wasn't a single survivor. Nobody knew what Magdalena might do, so the rescue effort was, at first, frantic. As daylight breaks over the sad scene, passengers and crew could finally see how close they'd come to making it safely into harbour. Magdalena is wedged hard into the shallows between two rocks about 2,400 feet, 750 metres southwest of the Ilha Pontuda in the Tijucas chain, and an agonisingly short 2 miles, 3 kilometres from shore. The white sandy beaches are clearly visible and they're almost within reach. But Magdalena is not moving. Her cruiser stern is lifted up from the water, and she's got a slight list over to starboard. The evacuation has to press on. It took just 8 minutes for Magdalena's well-drilled crew to get the lifeboats swung out and loaded. Passengers had begun to stream obediently into the lifeboats, and the crew had then started to lower them over the side. But now a bad swell is beginning to pick up, and it broke white and foamy against the ship's hull. The lifeboats have just as much chance as breaking up in the big waves or spilling their occupants out as saving them. Probably a greater chance, actually, so Captain Lee orders a halt to the operations. The boats swing, half suspended from their davits as the passengers inside do their best not to look down. With the passengers taken care of, for now, Lee is locked in a battle to try and save his ship. The ocean-going tugs, Tritao and Tenente Claudio and their crews, stare bewildered at the bizarre scene. Down below, the ship's pumps roar as they try to discharge tons of seawater that are flooding in from somewhere under the waterline. The voluminous number 3 cargo hold is filling up, and Magdalena is beginning to list to one side. The pumps just can't keep up. Lee wants to drop his anchors to keep Magdalena frozen solidly in place so she doesn't float away without warning, but the rising wind and the swell force his men to abandon the idea. Before long, though, other auxiliary vessels arrive on station. A big Brazilian freighter and then another tug that the Royal Mail's agents in Rio had sent. But there's little they can do for now. For nearly 3 hours, passengers remain huddled inside their lifeboats, awaiting some kind of plan. Finally, a flotilla of Brazilian Navy ships arrives to take them off, headed by the subchaser Guaporé. At 8 a.m, the little Navy ship ties up alongside, and Captain Lee sees his opportunity. He orders the ship's boats brought back up and the passengers loaded aboard the Navy vessels through the gangway doors. They slowly march down the stairwells and out through the doors, onto the decks of the submarine chasers, and before long, they're whisked away to shore. Among those rescued is the Barreto Agostinho family, who have been on holiday in Rio with their 2 young children. Once ashore, the family join the crowd of angry passengers who are already hurling words at representatives of Royal Mail's agency, demanding to know where they'll stay and if their luggage will be saved. The agents can set passengers up for the night in hotels downtown, and Magdalena's running mate, the old liner Alcantara, has been summoned to carry the passengers onwards, but the fate of their baggage is something well outside of the agent's control. It all comes down to what happens now, as Captain Lee, his crew, and a little fleet of rescue ships fight a heroic battle to try and save the Magdalena. Waves began to rap angrily against Magdalena's hull as the afternoon passed, but still the big ship was stuck fast. From the shore, a big crowd gathered to watch as the tug stood by waiting for the command from Captain Lee. Maybe at high tide the liner would be able to float off. Day turned into night, and Magdalena was being battered with the full force of the Atlantic, her hull shuddering with every impact. Now, the big swell was bringing the tide in even more, until finally it seemed like the right moment. The ship lurched, and then, around 11:30 p.m, she ground her way off the rocks. Captain Lee and his men could feel the familiar roll of the ship beneath their feet. She was afloat again, but now she ran the risk of blowing right into the other Tijucas Islands, or the coast itself. The big anchors were let go, their chains roaring out until they gripped the bottom, and Magdalena was held tightly in place to ride out the night. All that day, the ship's engineers had stayed at their posts, keeping their diesel auxiliary engines running so the big ship would have power. The impact with the rocks had dislodged her main steam lines, and with the terrifying danger of high-pressure steam venting into the stokehold and machine spaces where men were working, it meant the main power had to be shut off. But for now, the auxiliary engines could power the ship's lights and her pumps. The next dawn showed that even though she was afloat, not all was well aboard the Magdalena. She'd taken on a lot of water during the night. Her bow was way down, almost up to the nameplate, and the pumps could barely keep up with the tons and tons of water sloshing around the cargo hold. The tugs got into position and got their big horses and ropes aboard the liner. She would have to be towed into the harbour, but this presented a huge challenge. A ship without her own engine power and wallowing full of water like an immense steel whale is almost impossible to control, and the tugs would need now to nurse their charge through the tiny 1 mile wide narrows at the port's entrance. All this would be a challenge in a flat calm, but now the wind was blowing strongly and the sea was rearing up. A gust at just the right, or wrong moment, could smack against Magdalena's hull and turn the ship's own bulk into a giant sail, pushing her way off course and smashing her into the shore. It would not be an easy task, but still the tugs got ready. Towing Magdalena forwards would force her bow, already 45 feet deep, lower and lower into the water, so instead she'd have to go in reverse. Joining Captain Lee on board the ship was harbour pilot Antonio Carneiro, who marvelled at the beauty of the liner and tutted at the sad state she was in. With the tugs in place and the lines secured, the ship's anchors were pulled up, and the tug's engines howled into life. The lines tightened, and slowly, ever so slowly, Magdalena began to fight the swell and the wind and crawl along. For hours and hours, the tugs battled ahead, and the crowds on shore were treated to the bizarre sight of this magnificent big ship being pulled backwards with her bow way down into the water. It was a decent journey, about 22 kilometres, some 13.5 miles to safety in the harbour. But slowly, ever so slowly, Magdalena made headway at a paltry 3.5 knots. Sometime about 8 a.m, she was just going past the Palmas Light. Then the tugs made the turn north to bring her in line with the harbour's entrance. This would be the greatest challenge of all. After 6 hours of towing, approaching midday, the ships were on the final stretch. With just another couple of hours' effort, the liner would be home safe and the tug captains would stand to gain a big reward for their efforts. Captain Lee and his men must have been feeling the relief. They were almost there. But then it all fell apart. Just after midday, the ship was finally at the mouth of the harbour, and the water ahead was infinitely more calm and welcoming than what the tugs had been battling against for the last few hours. With a feeling of great pride and accomplishment, they dragged the behemoth in past Ilha Contenduba, but then something went wrong. Magdalena groaned and she shook once again. The vessel was 45 feet down in the water by the bow, and yet one glance at the charts for the entrance to the harbour would have shown tug captains, pilot, and Magdalena's skipper alike that the entrance to the harbour shallows out to about 36 through 42 feet for the entire approach. Maybe they thought the ship would simply glide over the sandy bottom with her momentum propelling her along. Whatever the plan, it didn't work. Magdalena groaned and creaked in protest, but still her masters drove her onward. All the while, the remaining crew began to feel her decks jostling dangerously beneath their feet. And so too did Captain Lee. He felt each terrifying shudder of the deck followed by a long, metallic groan. Ominously, Magdalena's bow, which had been so far down in the water, began to rise up again because something below was forcing it up. Somewhere deep inside the ship's hull, steel plates screamed against one another. The ship seemed to writhe in agony, swinging hard around. And then it happened. Glass began to shatter. Deck planks exploded with the sound of cannon fire, and steel plates began to buckle right below the bridge. Magdalena was being pulled apart. A sick kind of dizziness took over Captain Lee as he knew his ship could not hold herself together any longer. With a heavy heart, he made the decision that no captain ever wishes to make. He and his men would have to abandon ship. With heavy tension still on the tow lines, the tugs were told to edge closer to the stranded liner, and the lines were cut with blowtorches. An anchor was dropped from the bow to keep her in place. As every wave came, the ship bucked and groaned, but the crew swung out the boats and got themselves, as well as a small handful of passengers who'd stayed on board for some reason, away to safety. The engineers, who'd stayed at their posts keeping the auxiliary machinery going so Magdalena's lights would work, trundled up and got into their boats too. Not everybody was so lucky. First Officer Senior and a few others actually fell into the water and they had to be fished out. Senior was so exhausted after half an hour in the waves that he had to be carried ashore on a stretcher. Finally, it was just Captain Lee, the pilot Carnero, and a sailor left. They lowered themselves over the side and they were picked up by a line from a tug. Wet and cold, they watched as Magdalena met her dramatic demise. The sound she made was like nothing else. An article in the Times described it as a rending sound like the felling of a giant tree. Thousands of locals gathered to watch the spectacle. From the sea walls, from the windows of downtown office scrapers, all along the city's 20 miles of coastline. Finally, the hull could stand it no longer. She broke apart cleanly. The bow section, now unburdened by the heavy stern, suddenly floating and bouncing wildly, while the heavy stern section, no longer wedged on the sandbar, began to drift away completely out of control. It was the sight the city of Rio would see only once in a lifetime. The crowd gasped, while children flapped their hands in excitement as they watched the ship's stern pull away from the wreck and drift to the opposite side of the bay. Carried by the wind, it swung around wildly before coming softly to rest on a tiny beach just 2,000 feet, 617 metres long, at Empress Bay. So that was the sad end of Magdalena, and she presented an utterly strange sight with her bow section floating uneasily at anchor in the middle of the harbour entrance, and the stern, largely intact, sitting awkwardly on the beach. That night, searchlights were planted firmly on the bow to warn other ships away. It had already been an absolute circus, and the chance of yet another ship running into Magdalena's ruined bow section was not one the city's harbour authorities were willing to make. By next morning, the bow had at last sunk down after taking in water all night. Oranges, beer bottles, coal, baggage, and all other kinds of debris floated around the wreck, mixed in with thick black fuel oil that stained the pristine white beaches. "We finished up landing ourselves on Copacabana Beach," said former Magdalena liftboy Reuben Griffiths. "It was everybody's dream, but not in a lifeboat." This was not the type of send-off Captain Lee had envisioned for his final voyage, especially since the Royal Mail Line had given him command of the ship as a parting honour. At the Empress Beach, Brazilian soldiers stood guard to stop people streaming aboard the wrecked stern. Captain Lee and the Royal Mail Line now had to deal with the fallout. After a few days, salvage crews tried their best still to wrench the bow section free from the clutches of the harbour bottom, but the harbour was unwilling to give up its prize. Unrelenting currents impeded the salvage only more, which soon began to hold up traffic in the busy shipping channel of the Guanabara Bay. As far as the Royal Mail Lines and their underwriters were concerned, the ship's bow was now little more than a navigational hazard. On the 1st of May, the bow sank completely and had disappeared beneath the harbour's waves. Magdalena's stern, however, was a different matter. It was almost completely intact, with the valuable engines in place and all that impressive refrigeration machinery. Not only that, but she was still packed with hundreds of tons of meat, fruit, baggage, and mail. If it could all be hauled out, then at the very least, the value of the cargo could be recovered. That and the stern might be lightened enough to float off once again. Skilled shipbuilders could build and attach a whole new bow section. It had been done before, but first the stern would need to be emptied out. Salvage teams were able to prevent further flooding by sealing off compartments with steel plates. Then, working like machines on a production line, they began to haul all the goods out that they could. Nearly all the baggage and the mail was saved, while down in the cargo hold, some 450 tons of frozen meat and 2,000 cases of oranges were pulled out. Hopes were high that the big stern section could be floated off and saved intact. Days later, when the Alcantara arrived, the Barreto Agostinho family joined other relieved passengers who were excited to finally be going home. But just when they thought the holiday from hell was behind them, they encountered more misfortune. Somehow, the Royal Mail Line had overbooked the Alcantara, which meant that 2 members of the family had to stay behind for another 17 days until the next ship could take them home to Portugal. Needless to say, the Barreto Agostinho family weren't too pleased, and they might have second-guessed travelling again with Royal Mail. By June, hopes of saving Magdalena's stern had gone. There were just no firms in Rio up to the mammoth task, not just of refloating it, but then towing the stern to a shipyard large and capable enough of building a whole new bow. She was stuck, and finally her owners gave up. The hulk was put up for sale, and it was quickly bought by a local textiles firm for just £50,000, when the stern section's machinery had been valued at something closer to like $1 or $2 million. The ship's main steam turbine had a second life as a thermoelectric unit for the city of Manaus, generating enough electricity to keep it cool for the summer. The stern itself was stripped of everything save for the wireless equipment, and then it was slowly dismantled. Royal Mail Line's insurers had to pay out a whopping £2,295,000, and they claimed that the Magdalena's loss would be the biggest ever absorbed by the marine insurance market on a single hull up to that point. While those aboard the RMS Magdalena may not have had many kind words to say about their experience, there were a few silver linings. The forward two cargo holds in the bow had been flooded and destroyed, but almost all the frozen meat and fruit in the stern was saved. That, and Magdalena's designers had reserved baggage space for passengers in the stern of the ship, so almost all of that was saved, along with a huge quantity of mail. As time passed and slowly the ship was stripped and began to disappear, parts of it showed up in unexpected places. One of her bells and a few of her portholes were installed at a yacht club, giving patrons a nice view of the very bay where Magdalena had foundered. Later that year, a formal investigation was held to find out exactly who was responsible for the grounding of Royal Mail Line's brand new ship. For Captain Lee, the verdict came as no surprise. The court found both him and the first officer, Cyril Sr., responsible for the grounding, even though Lee wasn't present on the bridge when the incident occurred. In an interview with the Hawke's Bay Herald-Tribune, he lamented that he wished he hadn't stayed in bed any longer, and essentially accepted full responsibility. Even if he had made it to the bridge on time, there was still nothing he could have done to stop the collision. But safe navigation of the big ship through the narrow, dangerous channels should probably not have been left to Senior alone, who hadn't made such an approach to Rio since 1939. Even when he had been called to the bridge, he'd just taken his time. The court declared that Lee was guilty of a grave dereliction of duty and ruled the stranding of the RMS Magdalena was down to wrongful omission of the master and the first officer. The court also found that the ship stranded at least 10 minutes after Senior had obtained course bearings, which clearly indicated that to continue on the course would very shortly bring her on, or dangerously close to Tijucas Rocks, marked on the chart. Even with faulty compasses, such actions were inexcusable to the court, especially given that Magdalena's crew had radar available, but Senior deliberately chose not to use it because the weather was clear. If he had, in theory, he could have marked a correct bearing of the ship's position and then taken immediate action to steer her clear of danger ahead. Senior's error in judgment and his reliance on the old Mark I eyeball also became more damning when he had reported to Captain Lee that he was not confident of the initial position he'd marked. For the court, that was strong reason for him to take immediate action, but he didn't. There were no fatalities, nor was anyone seriously injured, aside from 3 crew who'd sustained some small burns, but the court chose to suspend Captain Lee's certificate for 2 years. This was more symbolic than anything else, since Lee intended to retire after Magdalena's maiden voyage, but it ensured he ended his career in some ignominy. It weighed heavily on him, and he'd shown clear dismay immediately after the disaster, but this turned to a forced stoicism. During the inquiry, it was reported that Captain Lee had sat impassive in the back of the court as the words grave dereliction of duty were read out before his peers and colleagues. A lifetime at sea was overshadowed by a single blunder. Once the court adjourned, he fled the room. The New York Times reported Lee was badly shaken from the ordeal. It was a very sad business. Unlike Captain Lee, though, First Officer Senior's certificate was suspended for only a year. Despite his supposed negligence, Senior knew his reputation was at stake, and if he ever wished to step foot on board another ship, he had to take accountability for his wrongdoing. In the Hawke's Bay Herald-Tribune, he confessed that he should have stopped the ship or turned to starboard or done both after reporting to the captain that the vessel was apparently half a mile north of her course. Unfortunately, not much else exists in the public domain on what happened to these two men after the hearing. For Captain Lee, retirement was already on the horizon. Before the loss of his ship, his wife had remarked simply, "My business will be him, and his business me." Whatever disappointment Captain Lee might have harboured, his wife was probably very ready to have him back home for good. What is certain is that the court's judgment marked a bitter end to one long-time maritime career and probably the nadir of a second. Britain's merchant marine had to face the uncomfortable, embarrassing fact that their newest, finest liner had been lost on its maiden voyage, a blow to the confidence of the ocean-going nation that was already down and out after the war. Fortunately, though, Magdalena's loss was soon overshadowed by the introduction and the long careers of a succession of impressive ocean liners. The Himalaya, Arcadia, Chusan and Iberia for P&O, the Orchides, Ronsay and the Orsova for Orient, all big liners, all extremely modern. Collectively, they grew Britain's tonnage and reclaimed their pre-war glory. They also erased the memory of Magdalena's sinking. The RMS Magdalena should have served into the 1970s, at least, but her career was cut short before it had even begun. It lasted only a couple of weeks, and unfortunately, her crew never got to experience the ship in its prime. Royal Mail Lines was devastated by Magdalena's loss, and their plans to expand and modernise their fleet on the South American run were ruined. The same old tired ships plodded on into the 1950s, joined by their newer fleetmate, the Andes, which had been built only just after the war as well. Alcantara and Asturias was scrapped in 1957 and 58, and Andes was converted to cruising for good in the early 60s. But Royal Mail Lines had one more crack at that South American liner service, and Harland & Wolff built them 3 final liners. The first was the gorgeous 20,000-ton RMS Amazon, an elegant modern cargo passenger ship that, apart from its all-white hull, looked almost like a near-identical sister ship to Magdalena, a vessel they'd built 10 years before. Soon, she was joined by sisters Aragon and Arlanza, and finally, Royal Mail Lines had 3 big, luxurious passenger ships on the South American run. For 10 more years, they operated that route, but there can be no doubt that the loss of the Magdalena had delayed their introduction, and within the decade, the company was beginning to founder. The proud line that had operated steamships since 1841 crumbled. In 1965, it was bought out, scrapped for parts, and absorbed into international subsidiaries. The proud house flag of the Royal Mail Line flew no more. And the company's destruction might have really started back in 1948, when their newest and finest ship was driven into the rocks off Rio de Janeiro.